Consciousness is a puzzling phenomenon that people have been trying to explain for thousands of years. And yet, even with the most modern technology and advanced science, it still manages to slip by. There are many reasons for this, but at first let's begin with the problem of defining consciousness, as many people seem to have different interpretations of what consciousness means. In my estimation, the most accurate description of consciousness is to say that it is the subjective experience of a being. So, consciousness isn't simply about taking in input in a certain kind of way, but is actually the experience of feeling as if the input is a certain kind of way. So, many people have described this phenomenon in many different ways. Typically, the most prototypical example is that of color, because it's easier to imagine. So, for example, you can try to explain to someone what it feels like to watch red, the color of red, but unless you actually have the immediate experience of seeing something that is red, it's really difficult to see how you can actually understand what it is like to see something that is red. And this is partly why it's so difficult to make a machine be conscious. We can make a very simple device that takes in certain input and says, this input is such and such, and yet we know that that device would not have an actual experience of that input. A very good example of this would be a piano. When you play the piano, obviously you're pressing keys, and those keys have a different, I'm not sure about the exact structure of a piano, but it has a certain mechanical structure which ends up producing a sound. Nobody would claim that a piano is conscious of the sound that it makes, because obviously it's not enough for something to simply receive input and produce output. There has to be some kind of experience involved. The nature of consciousness also makes it very difficult to research. In most fields like psychology and neuroscience, we simply rely on people's self-reports of being conscious in order to say that, a being is conscious. So, for instance, in psychological experiments, typically you would show an image or play a sound for a limited amount of time, and then you would ask the participant to tell you whether they consciously heard the stimulus that you provided. But obviously there is a very big problem here, which is that you can make a very simple device that could produce the exact same self-report. Just imagine something like a computer or a type of typewriter, which once you present this type of stimulus, it triggers certain mechanical changes, and then it prints the answer, I saw this color, or I heard this stimulus. Obviously, nobody would suggest that a simple typewriter of this sort was actually conscious of that stimulus. And so, simple empirical methods of trying to measure consciousness seem to be very inadequate when it comes to actually capturing its essence. Now, my point in this video is to extrapolate from this simple example to make the case that no robot and no system of artificial intelligence could ever be conscious in principle. And here is why. As long as AI and all of the other robotic devices that we invent are based in software engineering, they will always be met by this challenge of the typewriter or the piano that I mentioned before. Every programming language, at the end of the day, can be boiled down to a binary system. It doesn't matter how abstracted that language is or how simplistic it is. In every single case, programming languages are always, meta interpretations of underlying binary systems, meaning systems in which we have two states, typically a state where you have the presence of something and the state where you don't have the presence of something, otherwise conceptualized as 1 and 0. Those states are literal physical states. It is literally like, the having of the light bulb be active or having it be inactive. Just imagine something like that at a very small level. That is fundamentally where programming languages operate. They are abstractions because we have, different levels of interpretation from the binary system to the language that you view in your screen. But that doesn't change the fact that you're still, sort of pressing keys and changing binary states in order to have the appearance of something more complex. And because every piece of software out there is structured in this way, this means that fundamentally, no matter how complex the behavior of a robot might seem, at the end of the day, it is literally like pressing keys on a keyboard or a piano, as I said before. Because all of this software, this programming that goes on in the quote-unquote brain of the robot is merely a change in mechanical states at the very low level, which build up in a certain way that we want. And so I do not see any reason to assume that a robot that relies on software engineering could ever have the capacity to truly be conscious. It is as absurd, in my view, to see a robot as conscious as it would be to view a piano as a machine that experiences music. Some of you may recognize this sort of argument from the Chinese room experiment by John Searle, if I'm not mistaken. And it is quite similar. John Searle's Chinese room experiment is a thought experiment whereby you imagine a person in a room who receives symbols that they do not understand, and they simply follow some instructions on the walls, and then they, combine those symbols in order to produce a Chinese language, so sentences, paragraphs, etc., without ever having a true understanding of Chinese. Searle's point in this thought experiment is that no matter how complex a computational system might seem, the person, the mind inside the machine, is not going to be able to ever have an understanding or an experience of what they are truly producing. Now, my argument is quite similar to that, although it is intentionally broader. You see, there are many counter-arguments that you can make on the thought experiment of the Chinese room based on the components of the thought experiment. You might say that there is something problematic about having a person with a mind inside that room, or that the person represents only a piece of the puzzle, whereas the entire system is the brain, etc. So to avoid all of these counter-arguments, I make a way broader point, which is that every single piece of a computer, every single piece of a software program is quite like this interpreter in the Chinese room. It's not just that part, it's every single part. Because all of those, those aspects of a program or of a computer are essentially just mechanistic puzzles pushing stuff. So, you see, it's simply interpreting symbols without ever understanding why it is interpreting those symbols in this way. There is no person to have an experience there. There is no understanding fundamentally, because every single piece of the puzzle, not just the main interpreting part, every other piece, the memory part, the output part, everything comes down to pieces of metal pushing against each other, or, electrical signals, etc. I'm not really very, well versed in the mechanics of it, but you get the point. It is fundamentally a machine. And because it is fundamentally a machine, it is mechanical. And because it is mechanical, I say it can never be conscious, no matter how complex of a behavior it may display. The difficulty that some people seem to have with, the AI question and the software question comes from the misunderstanding that software and hardware is fundamentally different. They seem to have this view of computers whereby, the software is the brain and the hardware is the body, just as in humans, where the brain is obviously the mind and the rest of the body is the body. But this distinction fails to recognize the simple fact that software and hardware are ontologically the same. They have different levels, there are different levels of complexity, and they, obviously they work with different functions and for different reasons. But at their core, they're both mechanical. Every piece of code is ultimately reducible to changes at the binary level, just like the changes that happen in any other mechanical system in the hardware. And so, although computers and robots might one day talk like us and even cry like us, at their core, they will always be pianos playing keys. They might be complex and amusing, but they will never be conscious. Thank you.